using I to rewrite square roots of negative numbers. Okay, so we have a square root of a negative number here. It says write in terms of I. Okay, simplify your answer as much as possible. So in terms of square roots, you want to have whatever's underneath this radical symbol. It's radical. Or square root symbol, you want that to be positive and as small as possible. So we are looking for perfect squared numbers that are factors of 54. Now, if you want, you could go ahead and do something like this. Just go ahead and write this. We're going to have an I and then square root of 54 and deal with that separately. And you can kind of rearrange things as you want. But the way that works, by the way, is that we're taking square root of negative 54 and splitting it into square root of negative 1 times square root of 54. So we're going to do that also for stuff later on to simplify further with the square root of 54. But we're just splitting it up like that. And so anything that we can actually write differently, such as square root of negative 1, we do that. And the 54, though, we don't know how to write square root of 54 other than just as it is. So we're gonna keep it like that for now. Okay, so let's focus, though, on this 54. So 54, you might have to think about it and play around with your calculator, but it is 6 times 9. It's also a bunch of other things, right? 2 times 27, I don't know, 3 times something, but 18. Okay, sorry. But 9 is the only and the largest, therefore, perfect square number that goes into 54. So our perfect square numbers, you can maybe kind of make a little table of values. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it'd be good to know these at least through like 12 squared. Just write them down every so often. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 9, that's the guy we want to use, 16, 25, 36, so on and so forth. Okay, so we can write square root of 54, and we could have done this kind of all in one go instead of dealing with the I first, but square root of 54, let's write that as square root of 9 times 6. And then if you want, you can go ahead and write that as 2 separate square roots multiplied together. So square root of 9, we can actually do, that's a 3. So we have I times 3 times square root of 6. There's no other way to write that other than putting it in a calculator and seeing what the decimal is. And then normally, just by convention, instead of writing the I first, we would write this as 3I square root of 6. Sometimes you'll see this as 3 times the square root of 6 and the I kind of all the way to the right. I don't like this because the I can tend to look like it's up underneath the square root with the 6, and it's not. So I like to put the I in front. So I just spent like a really long time doing this problem. In practice, you don't need to have this much written down. So just to kind of explain what you really need to have, and then we'll do a couple of more problems. In practice, the way I would do this one is I would look at this and go, okay, so I'm going to have something to do with I. And then does 54 have any perfect square factors? Why, yes, it does. 9 goes into it. So I would actually think of this negative 54 as negative 9 times 6. And then think of taking the square root of negative 9 and then square root of 6. And square root of negative 9, to me, it makes sense that that's just 3i. So I would kind of do that all together. And then square root of 6 has to just stay square root of 6. So it's the thing that you actually take the square root of that comes outside. Okay, so now that we've done that problem like 5 times, let's do another one. And move some stuff down and make a little more space. So they like to give you these problems where they have this extra negative sign outside. it's not going to really affect anything. It's just going to mean that your final answer is going to be negative. This negative right here, I'm going to highlight it actually. This negative is going to tag along through the whole problem. Okay, so square root of negative 29. So that negative, since it's under the square root, is going to have, we're going to contribute to, I can't use my words right now. It's going to give us an I because we're going to have to take the square root of this negative. So 29, though, is actually a prime number. 29 does not have any perfect square factors other than 1. So we cannot simplify square root of 29 any further. Like, that's as simplified as it gets. So all we really can do is bring the square root of negative 1 out. So we're going to have this negative that's highlighted. And if you like, you could go ahead and write this as, underneath the square root, as negative 1 times positive 29. And then we have the negative outside, square root of negative 1 times square root of 29. And square root of negative 1 is I. So this finally is negative I square root of 29. And so that highlighted negative symbol that was in front, that just tagged along. It never did get to interact with the negative that was on the 29 because we had to take the square root of that negative 1, and it turned into an I. Okay, so let's do one more. So this one we're going to have kind of both issues. Okay, so we have negative square root of negative 32. So 32 is a little weird because you might be like, when you're looking for perfect square factors, you might think, oh, 4 and 8. But there's actually a larger perfect square factor than 4, and that would be 16. And so you kind of, I mean, it's okay to use the 4. You would just have to then simplify again because 8 itself has a factor of 4 in it. So you kind of have to play around until you get a little bit more comfortable maybe with this. So I'm going to think of 32 as being 16 times 2 though. Or in this case, negative 32. So we have this negative that's outside, and then square root, negative 16 times 2. And then, so negative on the outside. And square root of negative 16, so you can kind of maybe in your mind separate it out. Square root of negative 16 is 4i. Square root of 2 is just square root of 2. We can't actually take the square root, so it has to, the 2 stays inside the square root. If you're still not comfortable, though, doing that in your head, just write it as 2 separate square roots so that it's completely clear. Square root of negative 16 is what turns into the 4i.